record it. That way I can put it on the Facebook group if you want to refer back to it, or if anybody else wants to watch it. So, and we might have other people pop in as well. I am going to spotlight me, not that, you know, we don't want to see you. I remember how to do this. Oh, all right, so there we go. Like I was telling Connie, this is like the first, you know, I don't do a lot of training online, so it's a little rough, but we'll get through it. The good thing is both of you have had your machines for a minute, so you know all the stuff that you don't know, right? You know what you need to ask questions about, so that's going to be helpful. Normally what I would do is I would start from the very beginning and work our way up, but if it's just you two going to be here, we'll tailor it more specific to the issues that you're having, as well as anything like that. So any particular glaring issues, anything that you need help with, or anybody?
Not that I can think of. I wanted to do this because I'd never had the training with you, because of COVID and all that nonsense. So. And
it's what's fun is, it does suck not getting to go to everybody's house. Connie was the very last person that I squeaked in to see right before the world shut down. But even then, it's been a while, and sometimes it's hard to take all that information in and remember it. So if I had even trained you, Melissa, you might have not remembered much of it anyway. So what we'll do is I'm going to kind of go through the steps, and we'll just kind of touch on each one, and we'll see how you're doing. But I do want to encourage you to ask questions or let me know if there's anything specific I can help you with. So,
okay.
First up, usually in the training, we start right with loading the machine, because a lot of people have hesitations about that. And also we can't really do much without loading the quilt, right? So do either of you float your quilt tops, or do you pin the tops of your quilt?
I pin. I tried floating and I didn't have any luck. Have you floated, Connie? I know I'm not good at it.
Both. It just kind of depends on what I'm doing. The last one I did, actually, Angela, was your free motion challenge.
Nice.
I just finished it last night. And I did pin that one. I've floated them too. Just like I said, it just kind of depends what I'm doing. If I'm going to be moving back and forth with it. At this point, I don't even know if I have a preference.
Got it. Very good. Well, what I'll do is I'll show you how to load, and even though you know what you're doing, maybe we can have some, maybe there'll be some helpful hints that can help you be a little bit quicker with it. And then I'll show how to pin the top, since that's what you're used to, Melissa, but then we can also talk about why I wouldn't pin and how I would handle that. So that sound very good?
Yep.
Very good. All right. So I like being able to see your guys' faces, but I'll turn it back to me. All right. So 1 second, you're going to have to see me going in all different areas, but that's what's fun about it, right? Yay.
That's okay.
All right. So here is my machine. Let me put my camera back since I moved it. Can you still hear me okay?
Yep. I have to say, I love your shirt.
Thank you. Sometimes when you're mad at your hubby, you know how it is.
I might need one of those.
I think I got it from Maurice's, and I'm kind of like, sometimes you just need to tell everybody, like, just
yeah, exactly.
keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear it. Don't hear it.
That's right.
All right, so I have my machine set up here. I have the 8-foot frame just because that's what fits, but this is going to be the same no matter what. And I will go in a little bit more specifics about how I'm different than Handy Quilter. So I tell everybody, if it works, right? If you load it that way and it works, then stick with it. So don't switch what you're doing just based on what I'm doing. But if there's something that you find appealing about it, then give it a shot. And of course, you can let me know if you have any questions. So first, let's look at the orientation of the bars. So this particular frame is set up in the clear view mode. And that's where those two bars are kind of almost on top of each other, as opposed to horizontal or parallel. Are both of your machines set up like this?
Mine is, yes.
Okay, perfect. This is ideal because if you're using rulers or anything like that, it just kind of keeps it out of the way. The bar is not in your way. So that's, if you were to use the other way, you'd have to switch the bars you pin on, but since we all have the same, perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by loading my back. And of course, you all know you want to have extra all the way around, 4 inches all the way around as usually the rule of thumb. And if you ever quilt for customers, be very adamant about that because you need the little extra to kind of to work it in. So I have my backing right here. Now, the first thing I do a little different than Handy Quilter is I don't mark my leaders. I don't have a center marked on there. You don't have to always load in the center of your frame. You could scoot it to one way or the other, depending on the size of the quilt and whether you need to be closer or further away from something. Having that marked line is a good reference, but not necessary. Another question, can both of you reach behind your machine? Are you able to walk behind?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. That's a lot more helpful when it comes to pinning. So I'll show you that way. So I have my back. We know it goes pretty side down. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start pinning it to my leader. And I find that a lot of quilters kind of overthink this part. It doesn't matter, how you pin it. I'm going to see, can you see okay right here?
Yes.
When I grab my leader, I'm going to align the edges together. So those are aligned. And I have another camera I can switch to if you can't see, but I think that makes pretty much sense.
I think you're good.
Now, when I pin it to the leaders, it doesn't matter which side I pin from, but I like to pin from the leader side. I like to always have the pins on the leader side. Let me show you what that looks like here in a second. I need to train my kids how to do this stuff to help me out. I don't know. They're like, so surely they could help. So give it just a second. It will pop up. Okay, so here we go. I have it from the leader side. That's because when I go to unpin my quilt, my pins will always be on top. And that makes it easier to pull out and a little quicker. It's funny because I tend to be very, hardcore about making it efficient. Whatever is quicker is always better for me. Now let me switch it back out. Well,
So I'm curious, Angela, have you ever tried like the red snappers or the zippers or any of those? Or have you just always pinned and never even tried those?
Sorry, I need to make my video run. I have always just used pins. I have used red snappers before, but they were always like at a shop where I was teaching and they weren't broken in. And I think that's why they weren't appealing to me. I've heard since that, once you break them in, they're a little bit easier to pin on or clamp on. Totally up to you. I just always use pins. And I realize now I'm kind of like an old dog with new tricks.
I like pins too. I just didn't know. You hear a lot of people talk about how fast they are.
Yes.
So.
And there are, even our owners, we have some owners that just love them. So you could get their opinion on that. Okay, first of all, I have it kind of draped over the back. I like to get the bulk of my backing just up. That way I'm not fighting gravity and pinning at the same time. And for larger quilts, I might go and pin in sections, like foot sections, and then come back and fill in with more pins. The main idea being I don't want to be wrestling this whole quilt. It's a lot quicker just to do it in sections and then fill it in if it's a big quilt. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm pinning. You cannot overpin it, right? You can put as many pins as you want, no big deal. But I would say leave about an inch or so in between the pins. If you don't have enough pins, the tension will be different on the backing, and that's sometimes when you see the tucks that come on the back of the quilt. But like I said, if it works, it works. And the more you do it, the more you'll find the little cheats or hacks that you can get away with. I know that if a quilt backing is way bigger than the quilt top, I don't have to pin it as much because there won't be coming right up next to the edge, for example. So I'm pinning. Like watching paint dry, huh?
No, it's good.
All right, so once I have it pinned, again, I like to put my pins on the top. That way I can see them later. I'm going to start rolling it up on this bottom roller. So I'm going to take just a second and just smooth it out and make sure it's going to load consistently. That might mean I have to go all the way to the back and smooth it out. But if I do that, that means it's going to roll on nice and quick. So that's going to be helpful there. Another thing I want to point out to you is at the end, which happens to be all the way over here, I have the ratchets and my cogs that kind of hold it in place. If I put those ratchets in the down position, they will only roll the way it needs to go. So you don't have to worry about trying to remember which way to go. All right, so then I'm going to start rolling and smoothing and rolling and smoothing, making sure that it's not telescoping to one side or another, making sure that it's kind of going on really smooth. And I actually don't ever iron my backings. at all. If I have one that's really wrinkly, I will get my bottle, and I'll mist it real lightly with either water or Best Press or something like that. Not soaking, but lightly, and then roll it up. So mist and roll, and that will help kind of keep that fabric from wrinkling. It's funny because whenever I would quote for customers, they would say, oh, that my backing is really wrinkly. I would say, I'll take care of it and I won't even charge you for it. I would iron it, I would just spray it. Okay, so I'm gonna keep rolling and making sure that it's rolling in the right direction, right? If it starts to angle one way or the other, that means I might not have pinned it straight, or I need to make some adjustments. But I'm gonna go until the top of the back touches the table. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so, because I know, well, you can't see anyway because my machine's in the way. Because I know that I need a little bit extra space for the next step. All right, so since you all have room to get around to the back of your machine, I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna demonstrate, but I'll be behind the machine. So can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Now, this is a part that most new quilters forget. I bet you might have done it once or twice. I'm gonna take my back and I'm gonna go around this bar.
Oh yeah, I've done it.
I have too, probably 3 or 4 times.
Congratulations, you're completely normal. That's completely normal. Definitely happens a lot. Okay, now I said I don't mark the center mark. I don't have any marks lining this up, but what I am doing is I'm looking at my fabric and making sure that it's, parallel. I don't want to see any kind of fold lines like this.
Right.
If I see that, that means that it's not parallel to each other. So I'm going to take a second and make sure that's the case. Give me 1 second. I'm going to move you a little bit more centered. All right, so here's another thing I do a little different from Handy Quilter. So when I come around the back, I've ensured that it's smooth. What I do is I make the backing extend past the leader a little bit. So if it's like 1/2 inch or whatever, I make sure that it extends past the leader. Does that make sense? What this does is if my backing isn't cut perfectly straight, I'm going to make it straight to the leader. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Again, if you don't have extra backing or you're kind of cutting it close, you might not do that. But this means that I only need to have one straight edge to load my backing. So if it extends past, and this is definitely not cut straight, you can see that's like just cut right off the bolt. But I know it will be straight because I'm going to make it straight to my leader. Right?
Okay.
Okay, so when I'm pinning it, now I'm going to pin it. It doesn't matter how I pin it or where I pin it, but I'm always going to pin from the leader side. Again, because I want to have the pins on top when it's time to take it off. When I go to remove the quilt, I want to be able to quickly take those pins out. And if they're on the other side, they'll be kind of wrapped underneath and a little bit harder to get to. Do either one of you plan on quilting for customers?
I have been, I've started.
Oh, perfect. So I'm going to give some tips and pointers along the way. It may seem like obsessive sometimes. If you think about, multiplying that by the many quilts you do, any little bit will really save time.
Right.
When you quilt for customers, it's all about how long it takes you to do the quilt. So this means I don't have to fuss with a customer's quilt that the backing isn't right, or I can just line it up and go. Sorry, I kind of moved it around a little bit. Okay. So pin, pin, pin. Any questions so far? When I do my quilt top, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm still going to pin it to the leaders, and I'm still going to wrap it around. But I'm not going to worry so much that it's perfectly pinned. There's never going to be a lot of tension on the quilt top, mostly on the quilt back. But on the quilt back, I definitely want to have the pins about 1 inch apart, and I want to make sure that the ends are pinned as well. So even if I have 2 pins almost right on top of each other, I'd rather have that to make sure the edge is really held nicely. Okay, so let me show you real quick. I'll kind of zoom in. Sorry for the shakiness. You can see there where it extends past some of it. Even though it doesn't extend past much here, but it's a couple inches there, that's because the fabric wasn't cut straight. I did that as an example. It wasn't because I was being in a rush, right? Okay, so far so good?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Now, another thing I do a little different is once I get it pinned, I'm going to advance my bar And I advance it to where the pins are in between my two bars. You don't have to do that. You could put the pins out in front. But I like to have the pins in between the bars because what that's going to do is that's going to help give it a little bit more consistent tension right here. So it kind of helps prevent, it doesn't help prevent tucks, but it helps kind of extra little step to help keep that from happening. Of course, you could have the pins out in front, but we just don't want the pins underneath the bar because there's not a whole lot of clearance between the bar and the machine, right? So we don't want that to get in the way. But once that's in place, then I can tighten my quilt backing and then get ready for the next step. So sometimes the question comes up, well, how tight should this backing be? You don't want it so loose that it's like hanging down, but I don't want it so tight that it's vibrating while I'm quilting. So if you start quilting and you notice that that quilt sandwich is like moving a lot, that means you have it too tight. Loosen it up a notch or two, and that'll help out with that. If you think about it, if it's stretched too tight, it's going to be hard for the needle to stitch through that, kind of move through those fibers. Anybody had any issues with how tight they've had their machine or their frame or backing?
I have, I mean, and then I loosened it. I figured it out. That was probably my issue. Yeah.
Very, very good. You'll know if it's a problem, right? You'll definitely know.
Yeah.
Okay, so then if I want to do my quilt top, and you could do this first too, it doesn't have to be now, but I would pull my bottom leader up nice and high. And let's pretend this is my quilt top. I pieced it myself. Didn't I do a lovely job?
Beautiful.
Thank you, thank you. And I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm going to line up the edges, my leader, with my quilt top. Of course, I'm going to assume that the quilt top is pieced somewhat well, that I don't have to worry about trimming it up, but this is just a piece of fabric. So this one will have to be kind of creatively pinned. And like I said, you don't have to use as many pins. Ooh, sorry, it's blurry. Hold on a second. Let's kind of reset. Sorry, don't mind my hand. There we go. It doesn't need as many pins because we're not putting tension on it. So you could spread these out a couple inches if you want. It's up to you. But I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm still gonna pin from the leader side up. It doesn't matter, but I like how it always puts the pins on top. And then a little pin at the corners, of course. So far, so good, right?
Yep.
I really love being able to do this, but I miss being able to like look at your face and be like, you're good, you're good. People's faces will usually tell me if they understand. So if it feels like I'm asking a lot, it's just because I don't have that context. Okay.
So I've seen in some groups people talking about, or even like, I think maybe even on Handy Quilter, one of their videos about the leaders stretching or maybe having to be replaced, or does that happen?
I've never replaced my leaders, and I've had my machine, I think 9 years. So
Really?
I'm thinking about replacing because they're kind of dingy. I've never had trouble with them stretching out, but I will say I don't always pin directly in the center.
Right.
So I could see maybe, but I don't think I don't know. I've not seen it, but
Okay.
that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Unlike the backing, I'm just going to let this go on the floor if my floor is clean enough, because I don't want any drag on it. I kind of wanted a little bit of the drag on this because it helps smooth it out, but this, the top, not as important because we're just using that pinning to help hold it in place. It's not doing much besides that. So I'm just going to roll, make sure it's nice and smooth. It's right where it needs to be. And I'll leave a little bit of slack on there for the next step. I'll just get to about right there. So that's really right there is the biggest difference. I'll tell you the reason I don't float is because it takes a little bit longer. And if I need to access underneath, like maybe my batting is getting wrinkled, it's a little bit easier just to flip that quilt up and smooth it out. But of course, I don't have the pole cradles that your machine came with too. So that could be part of it as well. Okay, next step would be the batting. So I want batting. It doesn't have to be 4 inches bigger all around, but I do want it bigger than the quilt just a little bit. And if you have a little extra, it just gives you a little bit more to hold on to. And what I do a little different is I take it and I tuck it under this bar. So tucking it under the bar just helps kind of hold it up out of the way. And also the bulk under there gives it a little bit more consistent tension right there. So to do a little segue here, when I pin my quilt backing and I stretch it taut, where the pins are will be tighter than where they're not. So if I haven't pinned it close enough, I'll get a part where they're pulling and not pulling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I have the pins up here, now this bar makes it a little bit more consistent in the tension. And then this just helps do the same. That's it. It really doesn't make that big a deal. It's just something I've always kind of done. Then I'm going to tuck this out of the way because I don't want to deal with it right now. And here's another way that I differ from Handy Quilter. Not that any way is bad. You're just going to find your own style. It's like a recipe. You make it right the first time and then you make your own adjustments then. What Handy Quilter suggests you do is turn on your channel locks and stitch a plumb line up here. And that will give you that nice straight line to line up your quilt top. And that's perfect, but it takes too long. And again, I like to be more efficient. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my quilt top and I want to have, you know, some slack on it. Remember, only thing this is doing right here is kind of keeping the quilt up out of the way, keeping it from getting trampled and helping prevent you from quilting, you know, it up into it. So I'm going to take my quilt and I'm going to give myself a couple inches from the top. But I do need to make sure that it's square. Our whole goal when we are loading our quilt is we want to make it so that we can quilt it so that it's flat and square. Now, sometimes that's not possible to do both, but that's our goal. So if I just look at it and I think it might be level, I'm still going to measure. And I'm just going to grab any kind of ruler that has reference lines. I just use my machine quilting ruler, but it doesn't matter. And what I'll do is I'll just stick my ruler up against the bar. Go. And I kind of use the reference lines here to kind of make sure that it's straight. And I'll tug or manipulate based on if it's straight or not. That makes sense?
Yes.
Okay, and you, of course, you can use your channel lock as well. Once I know, and I'm going to obviously take a little bit of time, make sure that it's straight. I'm not too worried here because it's just our sample. Once I know that it's straight, I can even get a bigger ruler and make sure that the corners are square. Really important if you're dealing with a quilt that is not pieced very well. We joke that pieced with love. Once I have that top where it is, I don't want to touch it. I'm not going to make any adjustments until I stabilize the top and the sides. So when I'm working on the long arm, I'm thinking very linearly, right? So this is my area, my workspace. I want to make sure that it's all stabilized before I do any shifting. So this is when I would bring my machine over, stitch along the sides, the top, and back down. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
I don't want to quilt anywhere on the quilt with the side until the sides are stabilized. This is going to help ensure that the quilt stays square. We know that quilting will suck up some of that fabric, right? That might have been the problem you had, Melissa, when you're floating, right? Did it get off square, your quilt?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what's happening is it tends to suck up more in the center because there's usually more piecing in the center, and then it just makes it not flat. So we're going to pretend that I'm stitching up the side, along, and then down. Then once I've done that, then I can use my side clamps. Then I could tighten this up, my top, if I want to, you know, get more of it out of the way. And then I'm ready to start quilting. Does that make sense on how we're loading the quilt and working through it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, everybody is different, but after you've had some practice, which both of you have, you should probably be able to load a quilt in about 20 to 30 minutes at the most. Right. So if you're finding, especially if you're quilting for customers, if you're finding that you're having trouble getting it done that fast, then let's like set up a time to chat about it, because it shouldn't take forever. And usually it's because people are obsessing a little bit too much to make it perfect. Yes, we want it to be great, but it's not like we have to measure every little bit. Does that make sense?
It does. And I have been finding the center and doing that. So maybe I'll try it, just see if it makes it faster to.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, whatever you will do. Do you feel like it takes you longer than a half an hour to load a quilt?
I don't think so. I've never timed it though, so I don't know.
You know, if you were like, gosh, this is taking forever, then I wouldn't change it. I think you just do what you're doing. But if you do, like, just pay attention, not like time it, but just look at the watch and do it, and then see if it takes longer than that, then let's see what we can do to make it go faster. Because you know, if you're quilting for customers, you want to get to the quilting as quick as possible. But if what you're doing is working, don't change it. Don't change it. You both are solidly enough into your habits that we don't want to change that up.
Okay.
Okay, one thing real quick. Now, when I go to stabilize around my quilt area, what I don't want to do is shift the fabric. Now, we know that fabric can shift, it can be manipulated. What tends to happen is as we start quilting, the fabric is going to move. And if you start to see a ripple out ahead of your machine, you want to make sure that you don't keep pushing it over. So one thing that you can do is almost like a serpentine line or a tack stitch. Now I'll switch cameras here in a bit and I'll show you what this looks like. But basically, if this is my top, I'm going to kind of come off and on, off and on. I'm going to kind of just grab that little bit to hold it in place. I don't want to shift it. I want to hold it there because I know the quilting will kind of take care of most of that unless it's really, really bad. But if I keep smoothing it over or smoothing it down, I'm going to have to deal with it eventually. And where I don't want to push it is to the corners or the very last border, because then it's going to be too late to do anything about it, or, you know, to avoid the top. It's a lot harder. So it doesn't have to be a straight line. I can just kind of hop on and off to do that. And again, we'll show you what that looks like here in a second.
Almost like a rounded zigzag.
Kind of, yes, exactly, exactly. This is the case if you're using a loftier batting, a higher loft batting, or if it's, like I said, it's not piece fair where there's some fullness, then you can definitely do that. The whole purpose of stabilizing is just to kind of hold that in place to keep the quilting from taking it out of being square so that you don't have to worry about that when you start quilting. All right, once you have your area stabilized, again, I'm going to show you how to tie off and tie on if you need to. So I'll do that in a second. Your machine does have basting stitches. And so if you've ever played with those, has anybody played with those basting stitches or have any questions about them?
I use them.
Yep. So
Yeah, I have too.
good. So you know how to get there. You can definitely use that to, you know, do the base, but I just leave it. Well, I don't have basting stitches, first of all. So of course I have to use it. I have the Avante, but I just use the regular same speed I'm always using. So you could also do that if you wanted. It depends on your preferences. So I know that I can try to keep it pretty much within that 1/4 inch where the binding will go. And even if it veers off a little bit, I'm going to be putting a ton of quilting on it. So it's going to be fine. So just know that you can switch that out. Now, let's use our imagination and we're going to pretend that I'm doing some amazing quilting. Isn't it gorgeous? Micro quilting, feathers. Let's show you. When I'm dealing with this area right here, when I'm done and I'm ready to advance to the next section, I need to make sure this whole area is quilted or stabilized. If I have any area, and I like to, this is just what I made up. It's my own rule. If I have an area bigger than my hand, I'll stabilize it before I move on if I'm not going to quilt it. So for instance, I have a block in this row that I need to switch thread, but I'm going to come back and do it later. So what I need to do is stabilize that. And you could use your basting stitches to do that. But what I'll do is I'll just take my pins, my corsage pins, and I'll pin through the layers parallel to the bar. So if this were the area right here that I wasn't going to quilt, I just kind of, well, it'd be easier because I float, but I'm going to pin through those layers and make it parallel to the bar. The reason is if it's parallel to the bar, sorry, I'm like, whew, it looks like I'm drinking, but I'm not. Parallel to the bar, it will be able to roll up with the quilt. So that means I can just leave it there and come back and get it later. Basting stitches are great, but what I don't like about it is if I take one basting stitch out, sometimes the rest come out and maybe I don't want to do that whole area right then. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if you've tried that, like let's say you said, oh, I want to quilt the borders last. So I'm going to do only the center. If you tried that without stabilizing the borders as you go, you probably saw that you had fullness in your borders or tucks in your back because the fabric is going to shift as it wraps up and comes back. So I like to use pins, but whatever you use, just make sure you stabilize those areas. That's the one thing that's really different about a long arm versus a sewing machine. Now, let's say I'm advancing to the next section and let's pretend I'm over here and I need to stabilize my side, right? So I've advanced. Now I want to stitch down my two sides because I don't want to quilt any area until this is stabilized. But if my machine is over here, that's easy to get this side, right? No problem. But I'd have to break thread and come over here to do this side. Well, what I'll do, and this is my own little thing, I'll take my pins and I'll pin them, except this time I'll pin them perpendicular to the bar. So basically I'm using the pins kind of as my stitches. I'll line them up 1, 2, 3, nice and close. And then as I get to that area, then I'll take them out. So I'm using the pins to stabilize, not necessarily the stitching, but just to hold it until I get over there and then stitch it down. I know that's a lot to ask you to visualize, but the idea being you need to stabilize your sides as you go. And sometimes you can use pins to temporarily hold that in place until you get over there. The benefit being I don't have to break thread to go over to do that each time. Now, Connie, the one main difference with this is you have a pro stitcher. Melissa, you don't have a pro stitcher, right?
I do not.
Okay, so no problem, Melissa, you're good. We're golden. Connie, you cannot do that if you have a pro stitcher because you don't want to risk your machine running into those pins. So you do have to come over and stitch that down.
Okay.
No problem. It's much easier than dealing with your quilt getting caught, your machine getting caught in the quilt or breaking the
Right.
pin. But if you're freehanding, you can definitely do that.
Okay.
The one caveat. Now, again, imagination full force, right? I'm going to keep advancing my quilt, quilting in those sections, advance, stitching down the sides. But what I'm going to do is as I advance the quilt, I want to make sure that the quilt is progressing like it should. So if I advance to my next section and it looks like my blocks are not straight anymore, and I'm just looking visually, you could measure it, but if they start dipping in, that's not good, right? So I'm going to check that as I go, because what I don't want to do is not pay attention and have it be an issue at the end. I'd rather take care of it now than push it off to that point. One thing you can do, again, if this doesn't make sense, let me know. I can explain it a little bit better. When I get to the very end of the quilt top, so now my quilt top, the bottom of my quilt top is up here. I'm ready to finish this quilt up. I'm going to do the same thing I did on the top, stitch down the side, bottom, and up before I filled in. Does that make sense? Just like I did the top. But if I have a quilt top that is giving me issues, I might skip that second to last pass. So I call it a pass, like this would be my pass. I might skip past it, do the bottom first, and then finish it up. The reason being, if I have to take tucks or do any creative quilting, I can kind of push that up into the quilt and hide it from the borders. That's the main difference. If you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, just pretend I didn't say that. But do know that you can be creative with your quilting to help hide those tucks. I did have a business meeting about it where I recorded about how to be creative about problem quilts. I haven't got it on the website, but I'll get that up this week so you can check that out if you want. And I talk a little bit more about that. All right. Any questions about loading a quilt, advancing, taking it off the frame, which is the funnest part, right? That last reveal as you pull it down. Love that. Any issues either one of you have had with a particular quilt that we could try to diagnose?
I can't think of anything.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, right? That is good because that means
So do you float every quilt? There's never a situation where you will pin, Angela?
I float every quilt. There's never a situation I'll pin because I have the older style frame where this top is in the way, this bar. So I just took the bar off.
Okay.
I don't even have the top bar on my quilt, on my machine. And at the shop, you know, since I trained them, they float all the tops, even for the customers. Now, here are some of the drawbacks to it. So I already told you the good things, right? It's quicker. You can get under the quilt. For me, though, it's completely mental. When it's hanging, I can see how much I have left to go. I can see it rising up. And when the quilt comes off of the floor, I know that's a good thing. And it can also let me see what's coming. Is there a train wreck coming, right? If the corners of the quilt touch the floor before the center does, that's not good. So that's why. But if you live in an area with lots of traffic, with like people walking through, or you have a lot of pets and you're worried that a child is going to play on that, then that will help. But even in the shop, we just kind of tuck it around and over the roll of batting to keep it out of the way. But I float every top.
I've just tucked them back underneath there. Yeah, if I have something big.
Yep. I always pay special attention if it's a white quilt, background is white, because that's where those gray threads will drive you nuts. But other than that, it's just kind of little sleep up in between and then just right on to the next.
Okay.
If you want to try floating your tops, I would suggest starting with a smaller quilt. And every time I advance the quilt, the only thing I do a little different is I'll give the middle a little pull, just to like make sure that it's like nice and still progressing straight. That's not technical, but it just makes sure that I don't want the center of the quilt to suck up. That's usually what happens. So I kind of give it a little tug. Another thing you can do, I have it somewhere. Oh, here it is. If I was floating my top, I could get a clamp, and this would kind of work like a like pinning it, and it would just help kind of hold that down. So if my quilt top was hanging down, just help hold it in place.
I use that a lot.
Yes, and I also like these clamps. If let's say I take the quilt off and I realize I missed an area, not good. The clamp up here, and then I'll let the whole quilt hang down. True story. I'll lean on it like this, use my hips to my advantage, and then quilt it. So I don't even pin the bottom. It's just kind of hanging like that. But, you know, those are the things you figure out through all that practice. All right. So how do you all feel about threading your machine? Is everybody, obviously you've done a little bit of work, you probably feel pretty good about that, right? Do you want
Yeah.
me to show you how to thread it? I can. But if I don't have to, we won't.
I'm good with that.
Yeah, I am too.
All right, give me just 1 second because I do need to thread it. Next, what we're going to do is, well, let's just kind of work our way down. The handles on your Amara, when you're not in the Pro Stitcher, they have the 2 buttons right here. Oh, let me get where you can see it. Hello, Walters. Let me switch cameras real quick. You guys are so awesome and patient. I love it. So I'm like, well, what? Which? Oh, that's not what I mean. Sorry. Hold on. I had to get my my DSLR because it's just so hard to see. The webcam doesn't zoom in, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, first up, let's talk about your handlebars. Sorry, it's so dark. When you're not in Pro Stitcher, these buttons right here, these additional buttons, you have the diamond and the star. Those can be programmable. You can turn those into whatever you want them to be. And you can do that in settings. The reason I point this out is if you're quilting a lot, you can turn this one into your needle up and down button so that you don't have to switch hands. It can all be right here at your fingertip. But when you are in Pro Stitcher, Connie, those are going to have their own functions, which I think you already know about that.
Right.
You have your start stop button, of course, and then your needle up and down button. So this is like a half stitch. So if it's in the up position, if you push it, it'll go down. And if it's in down, it will come up. That's just going to help me pull up my thread. You can't see that, sorry. And then I also have my plus and my minus. Now this is going to serve a couple of benefits. There's a couple reasons why you might want to use that. Let me switch back out. If I am setting, sorry, I always push the wrong one. There we go. If I am wanting to set my stitch length, I can use my monitor or my screen, or I can just push this button. If I'm quilting in manual mode, as I'm quilting, I can hold the plus button down to speed up, kind of like a gas pedal, or I can hold the minus button to slow down, kind of like a brake. So that would be great if I'm switching from something like elongated swirls to tiny pebbles. I don't have to stop and change my speed. Totally up to you though. So you can incorporate those, or you can just not ever use them. What I love about the machines is there's so many settings. You don't have to use them all. You're just going to find what gives you the best ride and then go with it. All right, so that's the bars. Of course, what's really nice about your guys' machine, I'm trying not to be too jealous about it, but you have the adjustable handlebars. So if you wanted to make it more like micro quilting, I could take my bars and put them down and then angle them in. So I have like micro quilting handles. Or if I just want to change up my hand position. So if you start quilting for customers and you're doing freehand, Melissa, you might want to switch it up every once in a while just to keep you from getting, fatigued. I need to tighten it back up. It's not wanting to tighten. Have you played with it?
I put mine down and never moved them back up.
Perfect, because yeah, I think that's great. You're gonna find what feels more comfortable for you. Or maybe you like one down, but the other one up because you're gonna use your ruler. Right, so
Yeah.
you change independently of each other. So very, very fun. And as we go down to the needle, so I won't get too close. I'm sure you both have switched your needles out before, right? Hopefully, right? If you haven't, don't tell me you haven't. We'll just pretend. When it comes to your needle, it has a round shank, so the top of it is nice and round. That means we can put them in backwards. And if you've done that, you're also completely normal. So I usually tell people, you got about 2 or 3 times of putting that thing in backwards before you figure it out. The reason that it has a round shank is so that we can adjust the position of the eye of the needle, and that can help us with more finicky threads. So if you're active on Facebook groups or whatever, you might hear people saying, turn your needle to 530. Have you guys heard that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. So what that is saying is when the needle is in perfectly, that eye of your needle should be kind of aiming at 12 and 6. So like, but if I'm going to turn it, let me turn position here. If I'm going to turn it just ever so slightly more towards 530, that's going to ease the path of the thread through the eye of the needle. So if I look at my machine, my thread does come from the front, but almost from the side just a bit. So turning it just ever so much will help ease that path in. So that's why you hear that. The most important thing though is if you turn it too much one way or the other, it won't make a stitch because that scarf, that cutout that goes in the back, that's where the hook grabs the thread. So if it's turned too much, it won't be able to grab the thread. It doesn't hurt anything. And you'll know pretty quick if that's happening because you won't make any stitches. So if you've ever had that happen, that's no problem. When you change your needle, just the most important thing to remember is you want it all the way in the up position. I get it in that up position, then I finger tighten the screw, and then I find where the positioning needs to be and then finish tightening it down. So if it's all the way up or it won't go anymore, I feel it hitting up top, I know that's going to be fine, even if it's in backwards. Handy Quilter suggests changing your needle every quilt. And I'm here to say that I absolutely do everything Handy Quilter says, just like that. It's hard because it just depends on the size of quilt you're doing and the amount of quilting. But if you haven't changed your needle in a while and you're having tension problems or stitching problems, go ahead and switch out that needle and see if it can help that. If you think about what the needle is doing, it has to get through those layers of fabric and be in the right place for the hook to grab that thread. So that's a big ask. So if there's any dullness on the needle, it will slow that down ever so slightly and you could have some stitching issues. If you've hit a ruler and not broke your needle, you might switch it out anyway, because sometimes it's hard to tell if it is dulled at the end. It still feels sharp, but maybe it doesn't have that nice sharp point. And if you've been working on a quilt that has a lot of fusible on it, or a quilt with a lot of seams, like let's say it's a paper piece star quilt that has like 8 different fabrics coming. When you're done with the quilt, go ahead and switch it out because it could dull the needle, and that way just save you a little bit of heartache. So if you've ever quilted with a dull needle, you will know, because you'll hear the little popping sounds as it pierces the fabric instead of dividing those things. So you'll pretty much know when you're doing it. Tina Haas, genius. I don't know if she posted on Facebook. She said she was going to. She writes on the side of her machine with like a dry erase marker, the size needle that's in it and when she replaced it. So I thought that was
a good idea.
Smart. I'm like, that's genius. So if she switches thread, she'll know, will that needle work for it?
Yeah.
I said, you got to share that. That's a great tip. So
the other thing I found is that if you're using a batik quilt, batiks will dull it very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, batiks and sometimes sheets. So those fabrics are woven more tightly and a little bit different. So now the fabric the needle has to make it through those layers, and it definitely is a little bit harder, especially if you have batik on the top and bottom. Not that it can be done. You're just changing out the needle will save you a little bit of trouble, and then changing out when you're done as well. That's also why linen is so much fun to quilt. That weave is nice and loose. So there usually isn't a lot of tension or stitching issues because it's easy for the needle to make it through those fibers. I know that some people, it's funny because everybody shares helpful tips on, the interwebs. And I know that some people have suggested, not in our group, but like spraying something on the thread or putting something on the needle. I don't do that, and I don't really encourage that. It'll work the way it's supposed to work if everything is right. So you take that for what it's worth. If it works for you, it works for you. The one little caveat I will make to that is if you're quilting through a lot of fusible, let's say it's a fused quilt applique, what happens is as that needle goes through the fabric, it warms it up and it melts the glue ever so slightly. And then you can end up after a while with a tacky needle. Doesn't mean that it's dull. It just means that it has a little bit of residue. If you have like lens eyeglass wipes, that alcohol-based wipe or any kind of alcohol-based wipe, you can just wipe it off real quick, let it dry real quick, and that will take care of that. So especially if you clean your glasses, just wipe your needle off, just use it in the same time. All right, so needles, and what size needle you use depends on the size of thread that you have. Now, what's really fun about the Amara is on your screen, which we'll look at here in a second. On the info screen, it gives you a guide as to what size needles work with which size threads. So as I change the type of or the size of thread I'm using, I'll have to use a different needle. That's because the eye of the needle is bigger or smaller, and that will accompany or that will accommodate the thread size. But if you look at that screen, there's a lot of overlap. So let's say I'm going to just pick some numbers, but let's say a 16 thread, size 16 thread is perfect for 30, 40, or 50 weight threads. Well, then you look at 18 and it might say this is good for 40, 50, 60 weight threads. So there's an overlap between the two. That's because there's no standard weight definition across the industry. So a 50 weight cotton thread that's 3-ply will be thicker than a 50 weight poly thread. So just know that there is some overlap, and if you're having trouble, just try switching to the other bigger one and see if that helps it out. Usually for the most part though, if you're working with 30 to 60 weight thread, which most of us do, then the 16 or 18 needle is going to take care of that for you. Any questions about needles? Woohoo! So more than you ever wanted to know, right? You can also change out the feet on your machine. So the handy feet, Handy Quilter makes a lot of cool different feet on there. The only thing I would suggest is if you're going to do rulers, you want the Surefoot. That's going to keep your ruler from sliding over and breaking your needle and breaking your ruler and peeing your pants. It's just not fun. You can quilt without it. I don't suggest it. It only takes one time of throwing your machine at a time that you'll wish you just bought the Surefoot. But to change
And
it
yes, I can attest to that.
Uh-oh, did it happen to you?
Oh, yeah. I had to
Oh.
call Jeremy, the whole deal, had to take it to the local shop here and
Yep.
have her redo the time.
Yep.
I did not love it.
Yep. Yep. And I always hate it. And I had a training session earlier on the Moxie. I'm like, look, I know it sounds like I'm trying to sell you a $50 or $100 foot. That is not it. I'm trying to save you from the stress and heartache of that. But yes, I just leave my Surefoot on all the time because I switch in and out from my rulers quite frequently.
Yep.
You don't have to change it out. And the biggest difference though is, Connie, I would suggest the glide foot for your Amara if you're doing pro stitching.
Yeah, I use that a lot.
It's a life changer, right? So with that glide foot, it was like, yes, this is so great.
As long as you don't over tighten it.
Yes. And I will tell you, even not over tightening it, if you're using it a lot, it's going to end up. So basically, Becky probably has to get a new glide foot for each machine at the shop about once a year.
Okay.
Because she's tightening it, she's changing, and it's just what happens is it just starts to stretch that out, and it just takes one or two times of over tightening it, and then you can't get to stay on anymore. And
They need to put a metal shank on that.
I wish they would, and I there must be a reason they can't, or they might have that in the works. They're pretty good about all that. I will say though, like, it's again worth it just to get the next foot, because if that foot starts wobbling, it could get in the way and you could hit it and throw your machine out of time. So,
okay.
But if you're leaving it on, you're not switching it out, you might not have any issues with it. It's when because like we switch it out to do demos and stuff or training sessions. So that could be why. But you can't change out the feet. That's the most important thing. All right, so working our way down to the bobbin, fun bobbin times. Let me pull this one out. I won't go into too much detail about a lot of stuff because if you've already been quilting, you've got this. But does everybody know how to put the bobbin in correctly?
Yes.
I like to pin. It's a 9. Yep, put it from the back. One thing I will show you is, do you see that little blue thing or that little M-shaped kind of thing in there?
Yes.
So that's the anti-backlash spring. And that is something that helps keep the tension consistent as the bobbin empties, as it gets lighter. The reason I point it out is if you've ever dropped your bobbin case and had it pop out, that's usually people's first indication that it's even in there. They're like, what happened? Oh my gosh. So if that does happen, you can just snap it back in. But if it does happen and you step on it or a cat runs off with it, you don't have to have it in there. My machine actually didn't come with one. And if you use pre-wounds, do either one of you use pre-wounds?
I do.
Okay.
Yes.
On the box, it's like, take out the backlash spring, take it out. It kind of freaks you out, but the educator at Handy Quilter said you don't have to. So I leave that in there and I just put the magnet side back and don't have any issues with that. So
I've never taken mine out with those bobbins, so I've never had a problem.
Perfect.
I did hear to take it out, and then after I'd done that, then I heard, no, you don't have to anymore. So I just put it back in so I didn't lose it.
Perfect. Yep. Perfect. Again, what that does, I don't know if you can see here, it just kind of keeps, it's like a little spring. It just kind of keeps that bobbin up as it gets looser. All right. If we need to make adjustments on our bobbin case, there's that little screw right there, and that's where we're going to make our adjustments. But if we make adjustments, we're going to do little bit at a time, like seconds on a clock, not big movements. It doesn't take a lot to change the bobbin tension. Once you have it set for that kind of thread, I wouldn't touch it. If you have to make adjustments on this and you still have the same kind of thread, there's a different issue. It's a weird bobbin or it's something like that, because it should be set to where it's at. Now to test for your bobbin tension, we'll talk more about tension here in a second, but we're going to do the bobbin drop test. So I'm sure you've seen this where I lay the bobbin in my hand, bobbin side up, I grab that thread and I pick it up. Now, one thing I want to point out is my bobbin is not full. They want you to do this with a full bobbin. I've realized now that's because it gives it the proper weight that it needs. So if I do this and I'm like, oh, it's not moving, I might have to wiggle it to get it to fall. That's because it's just not a full bobbin. If this is too loose, it won't even pick up. And if it's too tight, I won't get it to move at all.
Okay.
What I should be able to do, and what you can do is if you have good tension now, go to your bobbin, hold it and just pull it and feel what that feels like. This is what it should feel like if tension is good. And that will give you some kind of guide to go with that. But really, once that's set, you should be able to set it and forget it. You shouldn't have any adjustments. if you do, let's say, switch to a slightly thicker thread, you might have to loosen it a bit. But if you're making a lot of adjustments and nothing is changing, that's not the problem. You're just making another problem to deal with, okay? So it should be very rare that you should have to make any big adjustments on this and you haven't switched threads. Okay, so I'm sure you probably have already found that. You might not have even touched your bobbin tension.
I've done very little with it.
Perfect, there's no reason to. But let's say I go from a pre-wound 60 weight, that's what I use, but then I put in a 60 weight bobbin that I wound. Well, it's not gonna be wound as tight, so I might have to tighten the tension just a bit. That's a good example of like when I would, but I'm switching out types of thread, so I'm probably gonna make a little bit of an adjustment. But again, you shouldn't have to make big adjustments. Is everybody, are you guys familiar with how to oil your machine, your bobbin area?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. We want to oil it every bobbin. If you put too much oil, it doesn't hurt it, but your first stitches will have a little bit of sloppy oil on it. And so come over to the edge into your batting and just kind of quilt through that and then come back and start over. You only need to put in like a drop, but if you get too much, no problem. I just kind of get it in there and I squeeze it. And so sometimes a little bit more comes out. You know, Jeremy, who's the tech, he just loves that, right? He's like, oh my gosh, stop talking. You're killing me. And then you want to make sure you keep that bobbin area clean. What's nice about the Amaras is the lit bobbin case area. So nice. That's really nice. And so you can see every little bit of lint. You can use canned air if you want. I don't, because my machine's older, doesn't have a backstop. I just use a makeup brush to keep the lint out. But if you do use canned air, just short spurts, we don't want to soak it in there, get it wet or anything like that. And watch out for your face, because if you spray it in there, it's going to come back at you. Especially if you use cotton. So natural fiber threads tend to have more lint. So if you're using Aurifil, even though that's a quality cotton, you're just naturally going to get more of a lint. So just make sure you clean it out. You'll know that it needs cleaned out when you start seeing globs of lint in the quilting on the back of your quilt. So that means there's some lint in there. Now, an interesting question came up on one of my training sessions, or one of the sessions. She said, I can't remember who said it now, but they said, well, do I have to take off the needle plate to do that? So on your machine, I'll show you real quick. This is the needle plate right here. And it has just 2 screws that hold it in. So I could take those screws off and take that plate out. And that's going to let me see the top of the bobbin case area. You don't need to do that. If you're feeling like spring cleaning, you want to get that squeaky clean, you can take it off and clean it out there, but it's not something you have to do every time you do it. We do want to keep that bobbin area clean so you don't get little lint balls on the back of your quilt, unless you want to call it like textured art quilting or something like that. Totally fine.
Fiber art.
Fiber art, yes. Like, this is organic. They just kind of show up whenever, and I don't control them. That's so funny because you can make a case for everything. I'm gonna take just 30 seconds. I'm gonna grab a bottle of water if that's okay. You guys
Sure.
talk about yourself, and then we'll move on. I'm back. Don't talk mean about me.
We wouldn't do that.
It's funny. I was doing a Zoom class and I had to go. We had a break, which they call it a bio break. I'm like, I'll just call it a break. And then when I came back in, they couldn't see me, but I was in there like, I don't know how she talks so much and so fast. I was like, they weren't talking bad about me. They were more like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. And so I was like, okay, guys, I'm back. Stop. All right. So that aside, let's talk about the different stitch functions that are on your machine and why you would use them. And then also a little bit about some of the menu features on your machine. Does that sound good?
Good.
Sure.
Yeah, because if you said no, I don't know what I would say different. So we would be stuck. All right. So look at that gorgeous touch screen. So nice. Whenever you turn your machine off or you stop quilting, this is the screen that's going to come up. Now, the home screen will have all your settings. We'll talk through that in a second, but I'm just going to poke through some of these settings real quick so you can play around with it. Now, I will tell you to have fun with it. You can't hurt anything, so come back here and see what you want to play with. The first one would be our lights area, so I can dim or turn off my lights depending on what it is I'm wanting to work on. Why is this important? If I'm working on a quilt with matching thread, let's say I have black thread on black fabric, I can turn off, well, let me turn that on, turn off my overhead light, and I can have my backlight on and it will cast a shadow on my quilting. So that will help me see where it is I've been. So that's an example of why we would want to be able to turn them off independently for each other. Because you might think, well, wow, I want all the lights I can have. I want all the brightness. Well, maybe. I will say in the shop, though, we really have to turn it down because it makes the other machines look really bad. So we'll dim them to about halfway. These machines have very, very bright lights. I turn it off when we're filming because sometimes it can be distracting to the camera. All right, when you go under your tools, so these are some different tools you have that you can work through. Once I touch that, it's going to bring up a bar down here of different stuff. And I'm sure you played with this, right? You've had fun playing with all the different things. I'll just point out a couple that are good to know. Make it a little closer here. Sorry, if you get dizzy, you might cover your eyes while I move these around. Okay, first of all, we have our timers. Now, this is going to be really helpful for those of you that quilt for customers, because if you're keeping track of how long a particular Pro Stitcher design takes to stitch out, or how long it takes you to quilt, this is going to be good to know for your pricing. So think of this like a tripometer. So this is my quilting time. This is how much time I'm spending only quilting. It's nothing else. And if I want to reset it because I want to start over, I can just hit that restart line. Or if I need to pause it because maybe I have some tension issues I need to work through and I don't want that to count against my quilting time, you can do that. Other than that, if you don't quilt for customers, this is perfect for guilt trips. Perfect. It was like, that quilt took me 30 hours to quilt, not counting the time it took to piece. But you can do the same for your stitches. So this could be like your odometer. So that's kind of a nice option if you want to know how many stitches you put in a project. And then you can also set an alarm if you want. I don't know why anybody would want an alarm to tell them to stop, but if you did, you can set that. The second most important thing that I want you to see is the update button. So from time to time, Handy Quilter comes out with updates for the Amara. Connie, you would have already known this because there's lots of updates for the Pro Stitcher. That happens quite frequently. For the machine itself, not too often, but when you are ready to do an update, this is where you would go. Not you, Connie, because you do it through your Pro Stitcher, but Melissa, you would do it through there.
I know they came out with one, but I never did anything with it. So,
you know, if it works, right? I don't know. Sometimes they come out with updates like fixes a bug for the Pro Stitcher specifically, but for the machine, usually it's not as common, but sometimes. If there's a really good one, I'll put it on the Facebook group like, hey, there's this good one, check it out. And there's a clear tutorial, a good tutorial that shows you how to do it. So it's not, don't be stressed out about that. All right, so there's other things down here, but those are the most important. And then settings is where you're going to make this machine for you. We're going to make your settings perfect. So the empty bobbin alarm, the best thing I can say is check out the owner's manual on how to go about setting that. You can actually tell it what weight thread you're going to put on your bobbin, and you can adjust it depending on if you do a lot of tying off. This is also where you'll adjust your buttons, your customizable buttons on your machine. And then it has some other options. This is the most important one, I think, though, is the alarms. So on the alarms, you can tell I don't have any of my alarms turned on. If I want them to make an audible noise, I have to turn them on in this area. It's telling me there's a low bobbin. That's funny. So I'll turn that off. So this one is a low bobbin thing. So if I set the bobbin at 100% when I start quilting with a new one, that will make an audible sound, just like we heard. If I don't want an audible sound, I won't turn that on. This right here, the thread break sensor, I really only think that's super important for Pro Stitcher, because when you're not right next to the machine, you want that sensor to go off when it breaks.
right.
I don't have it on because I'm free motioning. I can tell pretty quick when it's broken. And this next one is an overspeed alarm. If you're in stitch regulator and you're quilting too fast for the stitches that you've picked, it will beep. But this Amara has a powerful motor. I don't even know if anybody can outrun it. So in the settings, that's the most important, but you can definitely play around with that. Next one is the info screen. And this is going to give us a couple of things. So over here, I have my 3 different buttons. Again, we're not going to go into every single thing, but information, this is going to give me my lifetime counts and my lifetime machine time. So this would be like the odometer. If the first one is like the tripometer, this would be the odometer. So this one has 117,000 stitches. This machine isn't like a car where you hit 100,000 miles and then you have to replace the transmission. That's not it at all. You can rack up some good numbers on here. I was trying to remember what I have. I think it's like, I can't remember, like 100 million or some stitches on my machine. So I would say if anybody catches up with me, they get a prize. And also here, it will show you what hardware, what software you're working with. So if you're like, oh, I don't know if I've updated, I don't know if it's current, you can check it out here. Or if you talk to Handy Quilter, they might want that information, but that's the only thing you would really need that for. You have your threading guide. This will show you how to thread your machine. But this is a pretty handy little tool right here. This is your little needle guide that shows you which needles work for which threads. So play around with those. There really isn't anything that you can hurt. It's just going to help you. It's going to help give you the ride that you want. So I kind of joke, like it's like settings on a car, right? We want to have it nice where we want it. Okay, sorry, close your eyes if you get vertigo. I'm just trying to position this and it's like, ooh, I'm just going to leave it because I don't want
Remind me at what number of stitches it should be serviced.
Well, I'll have to ask Jeremy that because I know it's, sorry, I'm going to cover this up real quick and it just kind of needs to zoom back in. I can't remember, and I'm so bad with numbers. If I gave you a number, I would be wrong. Let me have Jeremy. I want to say it's
I
like
have in my head like
15 million or something like that.
10 million.
Yeah, 10 or 15 million.
Okay.
Or it can go a little bit longer. It's not going to be the end of the world. I mean, I went 5 years before I got mine serviced.
Okay.
Jeremy was like, your machine was so dirty. I was like, sorry. I mean, it's definitely not ideal. What he does is he opens it up and he re-lubricates all those, gears and stuff in there, packs it full of grease and stuff. But it's like, Connie, if you're like, oh, I know I'm not going to be in town until blah, 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 blah. You can also send it in and we can do it. Or if you have a local dealer in the area, because I know, Melissa, you're not super close. But yeah, that's besides oiling, that's the only other maintenance that needs to be done on it.
Okay.
All right, on our home screen though, this is going to be where we see the things. Oh, that light, hold on, let me turn it off. Gotcha. I'll get closer. I kind of want to be able to see you and the screen, but I don't think that's going to work. Well, maybe. No, that's a little bad. Sorry, guys. I don't know. I think what I'm going to end up doing, not that you asked, I think I'm going to end up just pre-recording these parts and then just showing the video. I think it'll be easier. Oh. All right. You know what, you silly thing. We'll just do this. All right. Sorry, guys. Again, so glad to have. We're going to just talk through it. You can look at your screen if you want to move over to it and be easier to see anyway. There's just a couple of things I want to point out. I know that you've had your machine for a little bit, so you probably have played with some different settings. I want to talk about really like the different stitch regulators. So on your home screen, you have a couple different options. You have your manual and your regulated. So manual, we know, means that once I turn that button on, it's going to start quilting. And whether I go slow or fast, that machine is going to stay the same speed. That means I'm going to get some organic stitch lengths when it comes to that. I like manual because I learned without a stitch regulator and I like the more consistent sound it makes. And I feel like it's a little bit easier to guide, but everybody is different. It doesn't mean that anybody has to do manual. I always suggest starting out in regulated precision. So regulated precision is what most people think of as a stitch regulator. As the machine speeds up, as I move it faster and slower, that motor will speed up and slow down, keeping those stitches nice and consistent. If that's something that appeals to you, I don't worry too much about that, but if you want that stitch length nice and consistent. What is really great for newer quilters is now I can hesitate, I can pause, I can think it over, I can stop to breathe because I'm not breathing while I'm quilting. I can do all that while quilting. So that's really nice. As you go though, like if manual's over here and regulated is over here, regulated precision, the stitch regulated in the cruise function is kind of like in between. So have either of you played with your cruise function at all?
I have.
Cool. Do you like it?
I do.
Awesome. How about you, Connie?
I think I've left it in precision.
Perfect. Again, it's going to be whatever you like, especially if you're pro stitching or doing ruler work. Ruler work is really great for precision. Cruise is just going to mean that when I stop the machine, it's still going to quilt very slowly so that I don't have to give it quite as big a nudge to get it to go. This really isn't such a big deal for the Amara because it does have such a powerful motor. For the smaller machines, it needs a little bit more of a push to get going, but the Amara is usually pretty ready to start quilting. But this really comes into play when you're doing points. So if I'm going to design the point, it needs to go at a set distance to make that point before it comes back. And so if it doesn't go far enough before I change direction, I might get a cutoff point. So we'll see it there. Or maybe I'm just outrunning the motor all the time. I want to start kind of baby stepping over to manual. It's a great option for that. Again, everybody is different. You're going to find what works for you. Okay. So as you make adjustments though, you can adjust again, you can adjust with the plus or minus button, or you can use your fingers to touch it. And do you know how to, let me pull in, I know that some people will watch this later that aren't you all. So I want to make sure I say it, but here's going to be the manual and the regulated. And when it's green, it will stay selected until I tell it differently. So it will stay like this until I decide I want to try something different. But when I push the manual, I'm going to get some different numbers. I know you guys know this. This is the benefit for future viewers. But this is the stitches per minute that I want it to do. So depending on the design or how fast I like to quilt, I'm going to adjust that. And I can also save it over here. Under regulated, if it's precision, there's going to be nothing under there. It's going to be just my stitches. But if I push the cruise, now I have both options. I have my stitches and my speed, and I can make adjustments to that there. So I can try and find what works for me, and it's going to be different on every quilt. Every person will be a little different. So definitely play around with that and find what works for you. You also on there have your empty bobbin alarm. So on the empty bobbin here, I don't know why I keep moving it back because it's going to come right back. Silly. Let's say I want to tell it, okay, I'm ready to put in a new bobbin. I want the empty bobbin warning to be on there. This says 100. If I push this, it will start counting down as I quilt. And when it hits 0, I'll start this right here. Sorry, that's not it. This is it. Now it's saying that's a full bobbin. It'll start counting down. And as it gets low, when it says it runs out, it will beep. The thing is, it doesn't actually know how much thread is in the bobbin or on the bobbin. It just knows how far you've quilted. So what it's doing is saying, okay, if she has 400 yards of thread, she's quilted 400 yards, it should be getting close to running out. I don't use that function on my machine because I can hear when it starts to get low, it kind of rattles a little bit. But if you want a little bit more information about that, check out the user manual on Handy Quilter's website because it goes into all the detail about that. Just know you can really dial that in. This button is kind of important. So there's a button on there that has your needle position. Basically, is you want it to stop in the up position or down position when you're done quilting. So as I quilt, great. When I turn it off, I usually want to go in the down position because I'm using rulers. I just want to stay where it's at. But Connie, you probably notice every time you turn on your machine, that darn thing goes back to the up position, huh?
Yeah.
That's because you have a pro stitcher and you want it in the up position. So it's kind of redoing that. Besides you and your pro stitcher, if you don't have a pro stitcher, it will always stay in the down position if that's where you want it. So that's kind of a safety feature for the pro stitcher. And then of course we have our onboard flywheel. So this is how I can raise or lower the needle without actually pushing the button. This is something I don't use very often. Not that I have an Amara, but I have this one. The one benefit I can see to that is if maybe I'm putting on a glide foot and I just want to see if it's going to hit the center. Okay, it's not going to hit the side. That might be the one time I would use that. On the back of your machine though is a manual hand wheel, actual round thing. And that's what you're going to use to manually take your needle up or down should your power go out or you need to get it out of the quilt and your whatever things come up like that. So you can manually take it out if you have a power issue. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. Give me 1 second. I'm going to move back to the FaceTime screen because I'm going to now just kind of talk in generals. I'm going to move my chair up. There's a few things that Handy Quilter wants me to tell you. They're not super important, but it's good to know. You want to make sure that you keep your rails nice and clean. So as you're quilting, lint will gather. I'm sure you probably have already seen this. Lint will gather in there. So about once a week, just wipe it off with we use rubbing alcohol on like a cotton pad. You'll know that you have issues when you feel like you're running over speed bumps and you think, what is on the table? And it turns out to be just a little bit of lint. It's crazy how big a difference that makes. One bad habit I have is I always tend to keep my threads on the table. Well, you got to be careful of that because those threads can get wrapped around the wheels. So if you're quilting and you're having a hard time moving it, or you're noticing a bobble every once in a while, this is especially the case on Pro Stitcher, Connie. You'll see this if it's wrapped around, you're like, look, I see the same bobble in every row. Check your wheels and make sure there's no thread wrapped around it. If there is, just try to tease it out with like a pair of tweezers and pull it out. It's a lot easier.
I had something a while back, and when I got down under there, I was surprised at the number of threads that were stuck in there, and I had my tweezers, and it was hard to get into.
Yeah, it is not ideal. One thing you can do is if you do send your machine in to be serviced, that's a great time to turn your carriage over and start cleaning out those wheels. But if you just try not to get it wrapped around in the first place, really helps as well.
Yeah.
But I'm so bad about that, so I'm not judging. I've been there. So keep your rails clean, especially and even on the carriage and your wheels too. So you can wipe off your wheels as well. So what I do to do that is I just hold the cotton ball in place and I just run the machine back and forth and those wheels kind of clean off there. Basically, that machine should slide like no problem. You should be able to use your fingertips to really create the designs. If you feel any resistance, any bumps or anything like that, there's something that needs to be taken care of. That way you can have a good experience. And I know, Connie, your machine's in a basement. I don't know about you, Melissa, but if your machine, well,
Mine too.
so yeah, so if it starts to settle, sometimes in, the basements will settle kind of weird. You can level your machine, your frame. You have leveling wheels at the bottom, or leveling feet at the bottom of your frame. So you'll know that's not level because your machine will keep running away from you. So you can adjust that. And I do encourage you, I know it's a pain, but you want the best quilting experience, best movement, especially if you're gonna be doing lots of quilts. So that's important. That stuff Handy Quilter wants me to tell you, it's not quite as important as other stuff, but it's just good to know. When it comes to cleaning off your machine, just wiping it off with a dust rag or something like that, you don't have to use any chemicals. We just keep it, it just gathers all that cotton dust is what tends to happen with that. Handy Quilter suggests that you have it plugged into a surge protector, but if you're not going to use your machine, Jeremy suggests just unplugging it every night because you don't want to trust your very expensive machine to a $10 surge protector. And especially, if those lightning storms come up, they can be troublesome. The Amara has 2 on and off switches. We have one in the back and one in the front. This is important to know because they both have to be turned on to turn on your machine. So if you happen to forget to turn on the back, but you turn on the front, you're like, it's not working, just check out the back. But I'm sure you all already know that. You learned that one too. That wasn't a problem for me. I only have one switch, but when we first got the Amara at the shop, they called her like, this thing is broken, it won't turn on. I'm like, oh no, turns out we weren't turning both buttons on. So what are you gonna do? That kind of thing. Usually at the end of the training, that's when we talk about threads, needles, or that's when we talk about tension, right? So thankfully you guys have had your machine a while, so you've probably dealt with a few tension issues, but I'll still just talk to it real briefly. And then we can, if you have any questions about that specifically. So when the top thread and the bottom thread meet, if they meet in the middle of the quilt sandwich, that's good tension. If it meets above or below, that's bad tension. That's not a lot of room for error. So when we have our threads, and let's say our bottom thread is showing up on the top, we need to make an adjustment, right? We need to either loosen our top thread or tighten our bottom thread. We're thinking like a tug of war, but we know that we don't want to make any adjustments on the bobbin thread, right? We just want to leave that alone. So all the adjustments are going to be made on the top. So on the top, on the tensioner on the side of the machine, that's how I'm going to adjust the tension there. And I'm going to turn it right to tighten and left to loosen it. And I'm going to make bigger movements. So if I'm adjusting tension on the bobbin, it's going to be like seconds on a clock, very small amounts. But up here, I can go almost a whole turn, right? So tighten it, test it, tighten it, and test it until it goes into place. Sounds so easy, right? Like, oh, okay, perfect. But if you've ever had a tension issue, you know it doesn't always work out that way. So first of all, if you have to make an adjustment to your tension, try an adjustment and then quilt it and then try it and test it. If it's not making any changes after 2 or 3 adjustments, that's not your problem, right? What I don't want you to do is keep tightening until it won't tighten any further and then now have another problem to fix, okay? If you come across a tension problem, it might not be a tension problem. It might be a thread issue. So that's where it gets a little confusing. If my tension is good, my tension can be good, but I can still have shredding thread and I can still have skip stitches. So sometimes we look at a thread issue and we call it a tension problem when it's not really. So what I suggest, and I know you've had your machine a while, so you probably don't need to hear this, but it just makes me feel better to tell you. If you start having an issue, the first thing I want you to do is to check your threading on your machine. Those 2 tension discs that are where we make the adjustments on our tension, those are 2 separate discs. And we want to make sure that thread is really flossed up in there, because if it's not, I'm not going to have any tension on my thread. And if it's not in those discs and I make adjustment on my tension, I'm now creating another problem to fix, right? So I want to check my thread. I also, for step 2, want to check my threading again. So I'm just joking. It's not really 2 steps, but really double check that. That's going to be, I just want to make sure that nothing is out of order before I start making adjustments. Then once that's established, it's right, then it's threaded correctly, then we need to ask what changed. So here's the good news. If you're having tension problems, it's something small. One little thing is causing a problem. The bad news is it can be one of 100 things, right? So what we need to do now is kind of diagnose what changed. It was fine, and then it wasn't, something changed. Sometimes we'll be able to figure that out, like what changed. Sometimes we won't. We'll just have to fix the problem. But Connie, let's say you call me, you're freaking out. Usually I tell people a good 3 freakouts. I mean, like that's how many times I had. Well, probably more. But since you have us, don't suffer alone. That's why you bought the machine from us. Don't suffer alone. Call us and let us help talk you through it. But let's say you call up and you're like, oh, my tension is messed up. It's not working. I'm like, okay, what is it doing specifically? And then what changed? Right. So I'm like, okay, Connie, so what have you, it was working and it wasn't, what changed? You'd be like, nothing happened. I'm like, okay, well, did you change the bobbin, change the needle? Like, well, I did rethread it, or I did change my bobbin. That's just going to give us the first place of where to look. If we're asking those questions, it's not because we're trying to trip you up. We're just diagnosing what the issue is. Then as you're making changes, change one thing at a time. This was another thing I was really bad about. Change one thing and then test, and another thing and then test. Because if I change 2 or 3 things, I could be counteracting my changing, or I'm not going to know what fixed the problem. I'm just going to be messing with stuff. And that's usually not a great option. I know you've had your machines for a while, so you've already been through it. Probably not necessary, but for brand new long armors, I suggest getting a spiral notebook, and anytime they have an issue, writing it down and writing what they do as they do it to fix it, because they'll be able to see what did change it. Or if they do have to call Jeremy, they can say, well, this is what I've done, and we'll know for a fact. But the more comfortable you get with your machine, the less issues you tend to have, right? Especially if you're free motioning. So whatever it is can be fixed. Another thing I'll say is sometimes you'll hear people say, my machine doesn't like this, or my machine doesn't like that. I totally believe that these machines can run any quality machine quilting thread. Now, will some have to be more finicky? Will you have to go slower? For sure, but you should be able to run any thread on this machine. I do tell quilters, long armors, to stick between the 50 and 60 weight, because that's just a good general one in the beginning. But as I know you both have experience, so now you can definitely extend out and try all the fun threads, the holographic threads and the monopoly and the metallic and all that stuff. So you can run any of that. There's some different things that have to be taken into account, but you can definitely do that. And then besides that, checking your threading, one thing at a time, calling us, please don't suffer alone. Go to the Facebook group, any of that. But the third thing, I just lost it. It's in my head. It is to, use high quality machine quilting thread. I like to say you can make a lot of shortcuts, right? You don't have to use the best quality fabric necessarily, but using high quality thread will save you a lot of heartache. So again, I say if it works, it works. So if I have somebody that has a serger and they want to use their serger thread, okay, if it works, it will. If it doesn't, then don't fight it. Just go get the machine quilting thread. Also, when I have people that have embroidery machines, this sometimes shows up and they're like, oh, I want to use all my beautiful rayon thread. Like, okay, it's not made for machine quilting. You can try it. If it works, it works. All right. But if it doesn't, then switch to your machine quilting thread. So that will really help save a lot of heartache. And that is also why I don't charge when I quilted for customers, I never had a thread charge. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it for you, right? I like to give my advice unsolicited. My kids don't love it, but quilters seem to like it. If you quilt for customers and you have a thread charge, even if it's $5, you're going to get people that say, oh, don't worry, you don't have to charge me. I have my own thread. And the last thing you want to do, I would even tell them like, oh, I'm sorry, it only runs a certain kind of thread. That's probably where that rumor comes around, right? Like it only runs so fine. That's the only thing it can do, because that's all I want to use, right? I don't want to use other people's thread, because I know my thread is for machine quilting. I know it's been in a climate controlled area, and I know it's not, years and years old. So that's an aside. You didn't ask that, but that will definitely help with that. Have either one of you had tension issues that you finally worked through, or have you been pretty lucky without having any of those?
I've had issues. And most of the time I find it's the eyelashes on the back. And I think a lot of times I don't get it in the tension discs right. I'll go back and rethread it, and that usually solves my issue.
Yep.
But I mean, I've had times where I've messed with it, and I finally got it.
Yeah. And the more you do that, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I had a quilt recently. It was a Bonnie Hunter,
Mhm,
one of those mystery quilts with tons of little pieces and tons of
Mhm.
seams.
mhm.
And I kept getting those weird little, I call them thread boogers on the back. So it
Mhm.
really wasn't a tension issue,
Mhm.
but I just kept getting these little spots. I finally figured out, I think this is what it was. You can tell me if I'm right, but I noticed that every once in a while, my thread would pop out of that first guide.
Mhm.
And I think it was because I was going too fast over a lot of those. So once I slowed down, that stopped happening. So I kind of figured out that maybe that was my issue. I don't know. You
That
think
that
it-
could be. I'll tell you, that problem right there is the hardest for me to diagnose because it's like, so it could, that basically what's happening there is when that take up lever goes down, there's a lot of slack on the thread so that it can pull it and then it yanks it back up, right? So what's happening is something is impeding it, so it's not pulling that nice stitch. And so sometimes it could be that right there going too fast, coming out of that thread guide. It could also be if you're using a thread that keeps falling, like monopoly is known for this, right? So it's so slick that as it's coming off the cone, it kind of slips, right? And so using a thread net helps with that. So yeah, I'm glad you figured it out, but it's one of those small little things. That would be an example of a thread issue, not necessarily a tension issue. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's so frustrating because that kind of stuff you don't figure out until the quilt comes around the back.
Yeah, and it looks perfect on top and everything seems
Butter
great. And
biscuit.
it's not, and it wasn't like all over the back of the
Yep,
quilt. It was
just
just every
random.
so often. It's
Yep.
like,
It could also be a bobbin not wound correctly. So if it's happening randomly, I mean, it's not really random. There's something we just got to figure it out. So the bobbin like kind of pulling. But yeah, it sounds like you figured it out, and that's fantastic. But yeah, those tension problems. Try to look at it like a mystery, not a frustration. I know that's it's so frustrating when they do happen, but the good thing is, Jeremiah, we've dealt with a lot, and so we've kind of honed in, kind of like, okay, just trust me. We have had owners make every mistake. I have made every mistake twice, right? So if you have to call us, it's fine. We want to help. And if it's an easy fix, even better. Like that is the ultimate outcome when it's just an easy fix. So, but don't suffer alone, because you definitely don't need to deal with that.
you probably never have tension issues now, do you?
Not really. And then when I do have tension issues, I know what it is, right? I'm like, crap, I know I need to change this needle. I got but I'm just going to power through. Right. But then I've also learned, like, okay, what did I just change? What's going on? But when you start quilting for customers, those things are just killers, right? Like the time suck. So I tried to keep all the variables the same. So I only offered sew fine because they have enough colors. I never was changing the type of thread. That kind of stuff helps. But I promise, if you run into one, you'll be like, oh, okay, I've had this happen before. I know this. We also have on the Facebook group, there's a file document that we had a meeting where we listed common issues and frequent suggestions. So you can do that too. The most important thing I would say is don't do anything drastic. Make a couple adjustments, but if you're like, oh, I think I need to adjust the height of my hopping foot, call us first, right? Because you shouldn't have to adjust the height of your hopping foot, that kind of stuff. It's a lot easier to head it off than to deal with now a new problem that's come up. But ultimately, you'll get towards like, yeah, I know why it's doing that. That's because I need to do this, but I'm just gonna do it. Yeah. One thing you might have found is that due to the mechanism of the long arm, that it tends to it loves to quilt left to right better than vice versa. So that's why on the Pro Stitcher, we always come back and go left to right. That doesn't mean you cannot quilt in both directions. So when I'm working my way across the quilt, I'll go come down here. I work my way back and forth. That means if I'm doing a long straight line and I'm going right to left, I could get shredding after a couple feet, right? It just has to do with the hook. So if I'm going to do long straight lines, I'm going to either stop, break thread, come over and do it like that, or I'm going to randomly break up the path a little bit. So like if you ever see a little quilt, like, oh, look, I put a random little starburst right there. Well, what that's doing is that's just kind of breaking up the direction to keep it from shredding. So that would be the one thing that I would suggest. And I know people will say, oh, you can use ballpoint needles, you can do this stuff. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So just letting you know, you should be able to go pretty far before it does that. It's not like you can quilt a straight line 3 inches and it shreds. That shouldn't happen. So if that's happening, there's something.
This is Angie in Ohio. I jumped in late.
Angie, how
Um,
is your grandbaby?
They're good.
I
the
love seeing
teeny
that.
tiny one
Oh, I
is
love
getting, she's 5.6 pounds. She's up to newborn diapers now.
Aw.
Grandpa's been down with her every day. So
I love the
she's doing
pictures.
great.
I've been praying for
Oh.
her. I love, sorry, it's not to change subject, but she's a
No.
little, what do you call them, Roo, kangaroo or something? There's some cute
Roo.
name. I'm
She's
like,
Roo.
oh,
Yep.
I love it. I
Yep.
love it. So
Oh,
anyway,
thank
sorry.
you.
Sorry. So what was your
Anyway,
question?
I'm glad that you said that, because especially if I'm quilting a straight line right to left, like I'm using slim.
Yep.
Yeah, it doesn't like that at all.
Mm-mm. Yep.
So I'm glad you said that. It's not me.
It's not you. And it's funny because sometimes it works and there's got to be a reason. I don't know. This is across long arms. It has to do with the hook mechanism and just it's pulling away from the way the thread comes in. That's just normal. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So, but like I said, you should be able to go a good section before you even start seeing.
Yep.
If you're going just a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's usually because, you're just going in a straight line. So I forget to slow down and take my time. So, but if I do that, then that seems to help. But yeah, it's not fun. That's a problem.
It's frustrating.
But I'm glad to know it's not me.
Absolutely. So like, let's say I'm at the bottom of my quilt and let's say I'm coming down this side, right? And I'm stitching and I'm stabilizing it. That's when I might do a little loop every once in a while. I'm not
okay.
break up the path. Now you can't do that if you're wanting straight line quilting or stitching in the ditch,
right?
But in that instance, I can incorporate a little bit of that. And I am a huge believer in efficiency. So if I'm saying it's just easier to break thread and go over and start another line, just do it. Now that also being said, yep. That also being said, if a customer asked me for that, I would say, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to add a pop of texture randomly, so just to make it look a little bit different, right? Like just to give it an organic look, to make it a little bit easier. So sometimes there's creative variations that you can do. So good. I'm glad you found that helpful. I was like, I see Ange, and I was like, I'm not sure who that is. We have a couple Angela owners, and I'm like, I don't know. So I'm glad that you piped up. I'm glad to hear your voice. So
it's me. Oh, well, thank you. It's good to see you. I was actually coming home from Mimi Monday, so that's why I was late.
No worries.
River with the full size Snickers bar. So I say I have a full size Snickers bar and a snack size.
Yep. Oh man, the problem with snack size, I'm like, oh, it's just a little guy. It's fine. I end up eating more Snickers because they're snack size. And if they're mini,
exactly.
If they're mini, I'm screwed. I'm just popping them like M&Ms. So yeah, Snickers is the best. That's one of my favorites. Anyway, I digress. Angela or Angie, have you had any trouble with your machine or any questions you have?
Not since when I hit the ruler, peed my pants, called, emailed with Jeremy back and forth, took it to the guy who works on my baby lock. But he kind of was able to fix it, but it never was quite right. So I took it to the dealer in Akron who said, why didn't you buy it from me? And it's like, I was in Missouri when I decided to buy it.
I was held hostage against my will. She wouldn't let me go.
It was Angela. She just sucks you in. But yeah, no, but she really did a good job fixing. She got my time, but yeah, it did knock the timing for a pretty good loop. So
it will definitely do that. There's a mechanism in there that if it hits, it also can throw it off this ledge to keep it from jamming up the whole motor. So hitting a ruler is not fun. It's not fun, but I'm glad you were able to.
Oh golly. Yep. Nope. You were right. Yep. You pee your pants, think you've destroyed the world.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
The sound it makes is just like, oh my God.
Oh, it was awful. It was awful.
Oh, well, I'm glad it was fixed. I will say that it's no big deal to take your machine to another. We have people bring their machines to us all the time that we didn't sell it to. So that's one of the benefits of having the worldwide Handy Quilter network. So
I couldn't get Stan. I tried to talk Stan into putting it in the car and bringing it to Jeremy, but he was like, no, we just went on vacation, so it's like,
well, next time talk him into it because he tells the best stories. I feel like we could sit there.
I know, right?
Listen to him tell stories all the time. I mean, not to exclude you, Connie and Melissa, her husband tells the funniest story. I mean, it was just cracking up. So Anyway.
Yeah, he does tell good stories, but well, I think he thought that if I got away with it once, I'd intentionally break it again. So
What?
maybe that could have been why.
You're like,
He,
well,
he
it's
might know me a little too well.
yeah, well. Now, which other owner do you know? You know another owner. Who was it? Is it or did a friend of yours brought you to retreat, right? How did you?
Oh, Marilyn Brauschler,
Yes. Oh, yes.
who moved to
Yes.
moved to Arizona, so
Mhm.
now I don't have a room in
Yep.
Missouri to
Well,
come
we'll take
visit.
care of you. You're fine, Angie. We'll take care of you.
I'll sleep with the goats, I promise.
Okay. Well, no, we'll get you a real room. Anyway, all right. I'll stop gabbing. Any other questions or issues, Melissa or Connie? Anything that I can cover? I mean, I know it was a lot, but I know that all three of you have had your machine for a while, so that's good. But anything I didn't touch on?
No,
I
this has
can't
been
think of
great.
anything.
Good. Good. I know sometimes what's nice about this kind of training session is you've already have your machine. So now you kind of know what you don't know. So it's a good kind of refresher. It's really hard when you get like all three besides you, Melissa, you didn't get training, but Connie and Angie, you both are like, I come in, I talk, I leave, and you're like, I don't remember what she said. So what's fun about the online ones, you're always welcome to participate, whether you've had your machine a couple days or, it's always fun to see familiar faces and make sure everybody's doing well. So
Yeah,
if
I
they're
think Don William is great.
Good. Yeah, I'm sorry, Melissa, that you just happened to be during the COVID and not get trained, but you just figured it out on your own, right?
Yeah, it's all good.
Well, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. You know how to get on the Facebook group and all that. So please, if you have any issues, this is why you bought it from us, so we can help you through it. So be sure to reach out to us if you need anything, okay?
Thank you.
All right, ladies, I'll let you go and have a great night. And hopefully I'll see you at the owners meeting. I think it's in 2 weeks. So hopefully I'll see you there.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Hopefully I won't be
Bye.
tied up with babies.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.